Welcome to Calm Mysteries, a quiet place where forgotten history, lost kingdoms, and unsolved secrets drift softly through time. There is nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to remember. Just listen, relax, and let the past carry you gently into sleep. The ritual no one understood. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a place where something sacred has just happened. You have probably felt it without naming it. That hush after a wedding ceremony, or the stillness at the edge of a bonfire when the flames finally settle into embers, or the odd collective breath that a crowd takes when something ancient and inexplicable has just been performed in front of them, and nobody is entirely sure what they just witnessed. It is not an empty silence. It is a silence full of something. And that something is the question that human beings have been asking for as long as they have been human beings, which is simply, what does this mean? Tonight, you're going to travel through time. Not in any dramatic or exhausting way. You're far too comfortable for that. You're going to drift gently through some of the most baffling ceremonies in human history, rituals that were performed with absolute sincerity and extraordinary effort by people who understood them completely and observed with profound confusion by everyone else. You are going to visit the shores of ancient Greece, the hilltops of Anatolia, the plazas of Mesoamerica, the waterlogged marshes of Northern Europe, and the torchlit corridors of Rome, and you're going to spend a little time in each place simply wondering, the way the best kind of historical thinking always begins, not with an answer, but with a very good question. Because here is the thing about rituals that nobody understood. The people performing them understood them perfectly. The confusion, almost always, belonged to the outsider, to the traveller from another land who watched open-mouthed as priests carried out procedures that seemed from the outside to have no logic whatsoever. To the anthropologist centuries later, sifting through fragments of pottery and second-hand descriptions, trying to reconstruct a living practice from its bones. To you, right now, lying comfortably in the dark, wondering how any of this ever made sense to anyone. And that gap between the performer who knows and the observer who doesn't is one of the most revealing spaces in all of human history. Because what fills that gap is not nonsense. What fills it is culture and belief, and a shared symbolic language so dense and so specific that it cannot survive translation. When a ritual looks absurd from the outside, it is almost never because the people performing it were absurd. It is because you are reading a text in a language you have never been taught, and you are calling it gibberish when really it is poetry. So, let us begin. Let us begin at the very beginning of the story, which is to say, let us begin somewhere in the middle of it, because that is where all the best stories actually start. Picture, if you will, a hilltop in what is now southern Turkey. The landscape is dry and pale and ancient in the way that certain landscapes are, not merely old, but primordial, as if the hills themselves remember being formed. The time is approximately 11,600 years ago, which means we are talking about a period so remote that the word ancient feels inadequate, though it is the best word we have. Agriculture has not yet been invented. The wheel is many thousands of years away. Writing is so far in the future that it might as well be science fiction. And yet, on this particular hilltop, a group of people, hunter-gatherers, technically, people who moved with the herds and slept under the stars and had no permanent address, have done something that should, by all rights, be impossible. They have built a temple, not a small one either, at a site we now call Göbekli Tepe, which means something close to Potbelly Hill in Turkish. Archaeologists beginning their excavations in the 1990s discovered a series of massive stone enclosures arranged in rough circles, filled with T-shaped limestone pillars standing as tall as 5.5 meters each and weighing up to 10 tons apiece. The pillars are covered in carvings: foxes, boars, cranes, vultures, scorpions, spiders, snakes. A whole menagerie of animals rendered with astonishing precision and care. Some of the pillars have arms carved into their sides, as though they are not merely columns, but figures, presences, entities standing in the room with you. The largest enclosures span roughly 20 meters across. There are at least 20 separate enclosures at the site, though only a fraction have been excavated, and the whole complex appears to have been in use for something like 1,500 years before being deliberately, carefully, intentionally buried. And no one knows what happened here. That is not quite true. Archaeologists have theories, some of them quite compelling. But the ritual life of Göbekli Tepe is essentially opaque to us. We know that animals were slaughtered here in large numbers because the bone fragments are everywhere. We know that people gathered here from considerable distances, probably seasonally, which means this was a place of pilgrimage of some kind. We know that beer was likely brewed and consumed on site, because the chemical traces are there in the limestone. We know that the T-shaped pillars were central to whatever happened here, and that the carved animals were not merely decorative, but almost certainly symbolic, meaningful, in ways that would have been immediately obvious to anyone who grew up in that culture, and are essentially illegible to us now. What was the ritual? What did people do when they gathered at Göbekli Tepe? What did they say or chant or refrain from saying? What were the rules? Because all rituals have rules, precise and often bewildering to outsiders. Who was allowed to enter which enclosure? What did the vultures mean? What did the headless human figures carved on some of the pillars represent? Was this a place of the dead, a cosmological map, a seasonal celebration, a gathering ground for feasting and alliance-making, a site of initiation? The answer for now is that we simply do not know, and there is something wonderful and slightly humbling about that. Here is one of the oldest monumental structures in human history, built with extraordinary effort and skill by people who were, in every neurological and cognitive sense, exactly as intelligent as you are, and we cannot read a single word of what they were saying. The ritual happened. It mattered enormously to the people who performed it, and it is to us almost entirely silent. Göbekli Tepe was buried around 8000 BC. Let us now move forward in time, though not as far forward as you might expect, to a different kind of mystery. Let us go to ancient Greece, to the city of Eleusis, to a set of ceremonies so famous and so important in the ancient world that to be uninitiated was considered a kind of spiritual poverty, and yet so thoroughly secret that 2,500 years of scholarship have not fully cracked them open. The Eleusinian Mysteries were celebrated annually for roughly 2,000 years, from sometime around the 15th century BC until the 4th century AD, when the Roman Emperor Theodosius I, Theodosius the Great, as history calls him, though that is the kind of title history hands out with some enthusiasm, shut down the pagan sanctuaries of the ancient world in a sweeping campaign of Christianization. For 2,000 years, the mysteries drew initiates from across the Greek-speaking world and eventually from across the Roman Empire. Emperors were initiated, philosophers were initiated, Cicero was initiated, Marcus Aurelius was initiated. The ceremonies were considered so profoundly transformative that Cicero wrote that among all the institutions Athens had produced, none was greater or more divine than the mysteries, and that through them the rough customs of savage life had been polished into something civilized and human. And we have almost no idea what actually happened during the central ceremony. We know the outline. The mysteries were held in honor of Demeter, the goddess of grain and the harvest, and her daughter Persephone, who was abducted by Hades and taken to the underworld, and who eventually returned to the surface each spring, her return coinciding with the return of growing things from the dead earth. The myth was well known. Everyone in the ancient world knew it. But the mysteries were not simply a retelling of the myth. They were something more direct, more experiential, more transforming than that. Initiates consistently reported that the experience fundamentally changed them, that they no longer feared death in the same way, that something had been shown to them, or revealed to them, or happened to them in the inner sanctum of the telesterion, the great initiation hall at Eleusis, that made the prospect of dying not merely bearable, but, in some accounts, genuinely welcome. The initiates were sworn to absolute secrecy, and for 2,000 years they kept that secret with a fidelity that is, honestly, remarkable. There were slip-ups, accusations, near exposures. The playwright Aeschylus was allegedly tried for inadvertently revealing something of the mysteries in his dramas, though he was acquitted. Alcibiades, the brilliant and catastrophically reckless Athenian politician, was accused of performing a parody of the mysteries at a private dinner party in the year 415 BC, and the scandal that followed contributed to his political destruction. These near misses suggest that the secret was real, substantial, something that could actually be parodied, not merely a vague sense of spiritual elevation. The best reconstruction scholars can offer goes something like this. The initiates, who numbered in the thousands during the most popular centuries, fasted for a period before the ceremony, then drank a ritual beverage called the kykeon, which is described in ancient sources as a mixture of barley water, and pennyroyal mint. Some modern researchers have proposed, compellingly if not conclusively, that the barley may have been infected with ergot, a fungus that grows on grain and contains compounds chemically related to LSD. If this is correct, and it remains deeply contested, then the central experience of the mysteries may have involved a genuine psychedelic episode, a dissolution of the boundary between self and cosmos that the initiates then interpreted through the framework of the Demeter and Persephone myth. The death of the self, the journey into darkness, the return into light. But we cannot be certain. What we know for certain is that something happened in the telesterion, that thousands upon thousands of people across 2,000 years described as the most important experience of their lives, and that it was performed according to precise ritual procedures by priests and priestesses who had inherited those procedures through generations, and that the whole thing was witnessed by no one who left us a complete account. The ritual was understood completely and intimately by the people who performed it and experienced it, and it remains to us one of the most tantalizing open questions in the history of religion, Now let us travel westward to Rome, and to a festival that is considerably less mysterious in its content, but almost infinitely more confusing in its apparent purpose. Let us talk about the Lupercalia. The Lupercalia was celebrated every year on the 15th of February, a date that will feel familiar to you, since it lands directly beside a holiday you almost certainly celebrate, or at least receive advertising about. February the 15th was not, however, a day of roses and chocolates in ancient Rome. It was a day of near nakedness, animal sacrifice, blood, laughter, frantic running, and a great deal of vigorous whipping, and the Romans themselves, who were not a people known for excessive prudishness, seem to have found it slightly strange. Even ancient Roman writers describing the Lupercalia used the language of puzzlement. It is old, they say. It is very old. We are not sure we understand it. We do it anyway, because it has always been done. Here is what happened, or at least what the sources tell us happened. On the morning of the 15th, a group of priests called the Luperci, the Brothers of the Wolf, or possibly the Brothers of the Purification, depending on which etymological argument you prefer, gathered at a cave on the Palatine Hill in Rome called the Lupercal. This was traditionally identified as the cave where the she-wolf had suckled the infants Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome. 2 male goats and a dog were sacrificed. Blood from the sacrifice was smeared on the foreheads of 2 young men of noble family using a bloody knife, and then immediately wiped away with wool soaked in milk. The young men then laughed. This was apparently required. After the laughter and the smearing and the wiping, the young men, and possibly other Luperci as well, stripped to essentially nothing, cut strips of hide from the sacrificed goats, and ran in a circuit around the base of the Palatine Hill, striking anyone they encountered with the strips of hide. Women, particularly women who were hoping to become pregnant or who were having difficulty conceiving, would position themselves along the route specifically to be struck. Being hit by the thong was considered beneficial, even essential, a kind of blessing, a fertility charm, an invitation to fruitfulness. The crowd around the runners was apparently festive, laughing, celebratory. People tried to get close enough to be struck. It was, by all accounts, a good time. What did it mean? The honest answer is that the Romans of the classical period were not entirely sure. They had theories. The festival was clearly connected to fertility and purification. The word februum, from which February takes its name, referred to ritual cleansing, and the whole ceremony had elements of both the agricultural and the sexual, the communal and the priestly. The cave of the Lupercal connected it to the founding mythology of Rome itself. The blood of the sacrifice, the milk-soaked wool, the running, the striking. Each of these had symbolic resonances that a Roman of the 3rd or 2nd century BC would have recognized and felt, in the way that you recognize and feel the symbolic weight of certain gestures, without necessarily being able to articulate why they matter. And yet, even Julius Caesar's contemporary, the great scholar and polymath Marcus Terentius Varro, described the Lupercalia as one of the oldest festivals in Rome, one whose origins were so remote that its original meaning had been partially lost. The ritual form had survived. The understanding of that form had not entirely survived with it. So you had, in the Rome of the 1st century BC, a city performing an ancient ceremony with great enthusiasm and a somewhat vague grasp of its original theology. The ritual had outlived its explanation. It was still powerful, still meaningful in an emotional and communal sense, still capable of generating exactly the kind of laughter and festivity and collective participation that makes a ceremony work. But the intellectual architecture behind it had partially crumbled, and what remained was the living practice. The running, the striking, the sacrifice, the smearing, the mandatory and apparently genuine laughter. When Pope Gelasius I attempted to suppress the Lupercalia in 494 AD, he wrote a somewhat exasperated letter, pointing out that even the Romans performing the ceremony could not adequately explain its benefits or meaning, which was both a good theological argument for suppression and also, inadvertently, one of the most honest things any authority figure has ever written about the nature of ancient ritual. Let us move now from Rome to somewhere colder, darker, and considerably more waterlogged. Let us go to the bogs of northern Europe, to a set of practices so strange and so ancient, and so thoroughly without written documentation that every explanation is essentially an educated guess. Let us talk about bog bodies and the ceremonies that may have produced them. Over the past several centuries, the peat bogs of Ireland, Britain, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Germany have yielded up, with a kind of slow and reluctant generosity, the preserved bodies of people who died in the bogs somewhere between the 5th century BC and the 4th century AD. There are hundreds of them. The preservative properties of the acidic, oxygen-poor peat have kept some of them in extraordinary condition. You can see the stubble on Tullinman's chin, the calluses on his hands, the expression on his face that reads, impossibly, like peaceful sleep. He was found in a bog in Denmark in 1950, and he had been there for approximately 2,300 years. He had been hanged. The noose was still around his neck, a braided leather rope pulled tight, and his death appears to have been careful and deliberate, not violent in the frenzied sense, but ritualized, almost gentle in its precision. He had eaten the last meal of a kind of porridge made from many different plant species, barley, linseed, knotweed, among many others, a meal that would have taken considerable effort to prepare, and that bore no resemblance to ordinary Iron Age eating habits. The meal itself appears to have been part of whatever happened to him. His body had been placed in the bog with care. His eyes were closed. Tullandman is not unusual in these respects. Bog bodies across northern Europe show similar patterns of deliberate ritualized death. Strangling, hanging, throat-cutting, sometimes multiple methods at once, a redundancy that suggests not cruelty but certainty, a need to make sure that what was happening actually happened. Many show signs of having been treated with a kind of reverence, both before and after death. Some were pinned down in the bog with wooden stakes, perhaps to keep them in place, perhaps for reasons we cannot reconstruct. Some were placed facing particular directions. Some appear to have been adorned, their hair arranged, their clothing carefully positioned. The classical Roman writer Tacitus, writing about the Germanic tribes in his work Germania, a text composed around 98 AD, mentions that certain categories of people among the tribes north of the Rhine were drowned in bogs as punishments or sacrifices. He mentions cowards, traitors, and those guilty of certain sexual crimes as among those who received this fate. But Tacitus was writing from the outside, from a Roman perspective, with Roman categories of crime and punishment, and his account almost certainly distorts more than it illuminates. The reality of what the bog represented to the people who used it, what the killing meant, who chose the victims and how, what they believed would happen as a result, what the last meal signified, why the noose rather than a blade remained stubbornly opaque. What we can say is that the bog was a liminal place, a threshold. In Celtic and Germanic cosmologies, bogs and marshes were commonly understood as boundaries between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond it. Not death exactly, but something like a door. To put something in a bog was to send it somewhere. The offerings found in bogs across northern Europe, weapons, jewellery, cauldrons of extraordinary beauty and craft, food, suggest a sustained and generous communication with whatever inhabited that in-between space. The people placed in the bogs may have been messengers, they may have been gifts, they may have been something else entirely, something for which we have no good modern category. The ritual was performed with care and intention and shared understanding by people who knew exactly what they were doing and why. We are the ones standing outside, reading the evidence and reaching tentatively toward meanings that may never be fully recovered. This is, if you think about it, a recurring theme, and it is worth pausing here, halfway through our journey, to sit with that theme for a moment, because it says something important, not just about ancient people, but about ritual itself. A ritual is, at its core, a shared act of meaning-making. It is something a group of people does together in a particular way, at a particular time, for reasons that are felt and believed, rather than merely argued. The power of ritual is inseparable from the shared understanding that makes it real. And when that shared understanding dissolves, when the culture that generated the ritual collapses or is conquered, or simply evolves past recognition, the ritual becomes either a fossil or a mystery, and sometimes both at once. This is why the outsider's account of ritual is almost always inadequate. It is not that the observer is stupid or prejudiced or lacking in intelligence, though sometimes that is also true. It is that ritual requires initiation. It requires, at minimum, a willingness to participate in the symbolic world that makes the actions meaningful, and that is very hard to do from outside. So let us continue our journey with this in mind. Let us travel now to the high plateaus of central Mexico, to the great Aztec city of Tenochtitlan, which sat on an island in a lake surrounded by mountains, and which was, at its height in the early 16th century, one of the largest cities in the world. Larger than London, larger than Seville, larger than almost any European city its Spanish conquerors would have known. And let us talk about one of the most dramatic and most systematically misunderstood rituals in human history. The new fire ceremony of the Aztec world, which took place every 52 years, at the end of what the Mexica called a calendar round, the point at which their two interlocking calendars of 365 days and 260 days completed a full cycle and aligned again, was possibly the most consequential ritual in the entire religious calendar. It was called Toxumulpilia, which translates approximately as the binding of the years. And on the night it was performed, every fire in the empire went out. Not figuratively, literally. Every hearth, every torch, every coal, in every city and village and temple under Aztec authority was extinguished. Cooking fires were doused. Temple fires were smothered. The perpetual sacred flames that burned in the great temples were put out. The darkness that fell over Tenochtitlan on that night was total, and it was intentional, and it was terrifying in the way that only a darkness you have chosen can be terrifying, because you have chosen it, knowing that you do not know whether the light will return. The ceremony began at sunset. A procession of priests climbed the Hill of the Star, a volcanic hill southeast of the city, where they would wait and watch the night sky. Specifically, they watched the Pleiades, a cluster of stars whose passage through the zenith, the point directly overhead, was the critical astronomical marker that would tell them whether the world would continue, because that was what was at stake. The Aztec understanding of cosmic time held that the world had ended and been reborn multiple times before, and that on the night of the new fire ceremony, it might end again if the Pleiades did not pass through the zenith, or in some accounts, if the priests failed to produce the new fire, the world would be destroyed by monsters from the sky, and the darkness would be permanent. When the Pleiades reached the zenith, a fire was drilled into the chest of a sacrificial victim. The new fire was kindled directly in a human body. The moment it got, runners with torches lit from that fire sprinted in every direction, carrying the new light back to the temples first, and then to every house and hearth in the empire. People who had spent the night in terror, who had smashed their household idols and their cooking pots, cast their possessions into water, plastered over their faces with masks of maguey leaves so that the monsters from the sky would not recognize them, emerged from their houses and welcomed the fire back with a relief so profound it was almost like being born again. Which is, of course, exactly what it was supposed to feel like. The Spanish priests and missionaries who witnessed or heard accounts of this ceremony were horrified, as they were horrified by most things Aztec. Their accounts, which are almost the only written accounts we have, described it in the language of devil worship, primitive superstition, and barbarous cruelty. What they could not or would not see was the sophistication of the cosmological system that made the ceremony meaningful, the genuine and well-founded astronomical observation that underlay it, or the real psychological and social function it served for the people who performed it. Because here is what the new fire ceremony actually did. It reset time. Every 52 years, the accumulated weight of the past, its debts, its grievances, its failures, its unresolved tensions, was symbolically cleared away. People settled accounts. Old feuds were set aside, at least nominally. The world was given permission to begin again. The terror of the dark night was real, and the relief of the returning fire was real, and the social renewal that followed was real. The ceremony worked in the deepest sense of what working means for a ritual, because it produced a genuine collective experience of death and rebirth, of darkness and light, of the possibility of ending and the reality of continuation. To the Spanish missionaries who saw only the sacrifice and the smashed idols and the pasted faces, it was madness. To the Mexica, it was the most rational possible response to the conditions of cosmic uncertainty they believed they inhabited. The ritual made complete and perfect sense within its own symbolic universe. And that symbolic universe was, by any fair measure, just as elaborate, just as internally consistent, and just as emotionally compelling as the symbolic universe of the Christianity that would eventually replace it. Let us travel now to a quieter place, though no less strange. Let us go to ancient Egypt, to the banks of the Nile in the time of the New Kingdom. The great centuries of Rameses and Thutmose and Amenhotep, roughly the 16th through the 11th centuries BC, and let us consider a ritual that happened in the innermost sanctum of every temple in Egypt every single morning, and that almost no one outside the priesthood ever saw. The morning ritual of the divine statue was performed before dawn. A priest, ritually purified through bathing, fumigation with incense, and the chewing of natron, a kind of salt used extensively in Egyptian religious practice, would approach the sealed inner sanctuary of the temple where the cult statue of the god resided. He would break the clay seal on the door, open it, and greet the god. The god had been asleep. This was not metaphorical. The Egyptians genuinely understood the statue, once properly animated through the ritual of the opening of the mouth, as inhabited by the divine presence, and that presence needed to be woken up in the morning, fed, clothed, anointed, and put to bed at night. The priest would remove yesterday's clothing from the statue and clean it with incense and natron. Fresh linen, white and spotless, representing purity, was draped around the figure. Kohl was applied around the statue's eyes. Food and drink were presented: bread, beer, wine, meat, vegetables, laid out in specific arrangements that followed precise protocols. The priest would then back out of the sanctuary, sweeping away his footprints as he went, closing and resealing the door. The god's privacy was restored. The god would eat in the divine way that gods eat, which involves the essence of the food rather than its physical substance, the offerings remaining untouched in their physical form while their spiritual nourishment was absorbed. To a Greek traveller of the 5th century BC, this was baffling. The Egyptians were clearly intelligent and clearly had a very sophisticated civilization. The Greeks admired them enormously and credited them with enormous wisdom. But the business of dressing and feeding stone statues struck even sympathetic Greek observers as peculiar. Herodotus visited Egypt and wrote about its religious practices with a combination of admiration and bewilderment that is rather charming to read millennia later. He understood that the rituals were serious and ancient, that they were connected to beliefs he only partially grasped, and he reported them as faithfully as he could while clearly struggling to make sense of them. What Herodotus could not access because it was not available to him, not being available even to most Egyptians who were not priests, was the theological framework that made the morning ritual not merely sensible, but essential. The Egyptian temple was not simply a building where worship happened. It was the world. It was a model of the cosmos. Its proportions and orientations and decorative programs all mapping the structure of reality as the Egyptians understood it. The innermost sanctuary was the primordial mound that rose from the waters of chaos at the first moment of creation. The god in the sanctuary was not a symbol of divine power, but the actual locus of it, the point where divine energy entered the world and sustained it. Without the morning ritual, without the waking, the feeding, the clothing, the divine presence could not function in the world, and if the divine presence could not function in the world itself would begin to fail. The ritual was maintenance. It was infrastructure. The priests were not engaging in piety. They were doing the work that kept the sun rising and the Nile flooding and the grain growing and the social order holding together. This is, if you can hold it in your mind without laughing, and please do try not to laugh, because the people who believed it were no less rational than you are, a completely coherent cosmological system. Within its own framework, it makes perfect sense. The confusion arises only from the outside, from a perspective that does not share the fundamental premises, and therefore cannot follow the logic, no matter how carefully it is explained. This is the pattern, repeated over and over through human history. Ritual makes sense from the inside and looks strange from the outside. And the strangeness is not in the ritual. The strangeness is in the gap between cosmologies, the distance between one world of meaning and another. Let us travel, for our final stop of the evening, to a place that is geographically closer to you, but perhaps no less strange in its particulars. Let us go to medieval Europe, to the period roughly spanning the 9th through the 14th centuries AD, and let us talk about a practice that baffled travellers, horrified ecclesiastical authorities, and has puzzled historians ever since. The ritual known, depending on where and when it was practiced, as the Feast of Fools, or the Festival of the Subdeacon, or the Boy Bishop, or simply as that thing the clergy does in the days after Christmas that we have been trying to stop for 300 years. The Feast of Fools was celebrated primarily in France, though versions of it existed across Western Europe, and it was performed primarily within the church itself, in cathedrals and abbeys and collegiate churches, by the lower clergy, the subdeacons and deacons and minor clerics, who occupied the bottom rungs of the ecclesiastical hierarchy. It took place in the days around the 1st of January, sometimes on the feast of Saint Stephen, sometimes on the feast of the Holy Innocents, sometimes on the feast of the Circumcision, the specific date varying by location and tradition. And what happened during it was, depending on your point of view, either a harmless if rowdy celebration or an act of extraordinary ecclesiastical mischief. The lower clergy elected a mock bishop, or a mock pope, or a mock abbot, a lord of misrule, a figure of inverted authority. The liturgy was performed with substitutions, parodies, additions, elements that would have been instantly recognizable to any medieval churchgoer as deliberately wrong in the most theatrical possible way. Incense was burned in old shoes instead of censers. The participants wore masks, or dressed as women, or wore their vestments inside out. They ate sausages at the altar. They played dice during the Mass. They sang raucous songs. They brayed like donkeys at the appropriate moments of the liturgy. Or rather, at the inappropriate moments, which was the point. The whole structure of sacred hierarchy was turned upside down for a day, the highest made low and the lowest raised up, authority mocked, dignity deflated, and everyone, apparently, had a wonderful time. This drove the church's senior hierarchy absolutely mad. There are papal condemnations of the Feast of Fools from as early as the 12th century, and the condemnations keep coming, decade after decade, century after century, which tells you something important about how effective the condemnations were. The Faculty of Theology at the University of Paris issued a particularly vehement denunciation in 1444, describing the proceedings in terms that suggest the authors found the whole thing genuinely alarming, and asserting that it must stop at once. It did not stop. Versions of it were still being practiced in various forms into the 16th and 17th centuries, at which point the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation together finally generated enough institutional pressure to genuinely suppress it. Why couldn't the authorities stop it? Because the people performing it understood it in a way the authorities could not or would not engage with. The Feast of Fools was not simply chaos, not mere rowdiness dressed up in ecclesiastical clothing. It was, at its deepest level, a ritual management of social tension, a sanctioned and bounded inversion of hierarchy that allowed the frustrations and resentments of the lower clergy, who were often poorly paid, poorly respected, and poorly positioned within the church's rigid social structure, to find expression in a form that was temporary, theatrical, and ultimately unthreatening, precisely because it was so clearly framed as play. Scholars in the 20th century, most notably the Russian literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin, wrote at length about what he called the carnivalesque, the periodic licensed reversal of social norms that appears in cultures across time and geography, and that seems to serve the social function of releasing pressure in a controlled way, so that the structure being mocked can continue to function after the mockery is over. The medieval peasant who was allowed to be the lord of misrule for a day was not a revolutionary. He was a safety valve, and the church's senior hierarchy, who kept trying to close the valve, were, despite their considerable learning and genuine piety, missing the point of what the valve was for. The ritual made sense to the people who performed it, and made no sense to the people who tried to stop it, and this impasse lasted for approximately 300 years, which is one of the longer documented instances of institutional frustration in Western history. By now, you may be noticing something. You may have drifted somewhat from the beginning of this journey, your thoughts growing slower and softer, the specific details of ancient rituals blurring pleasantly at their edges into something more general, more dreamlike. This is entirely appropriate. The history of human ceremony is not a subject that demands sharp focus. It rewards something more like open attention, a willingness to hold contradictions gently, to sit with mystery without needing to resolve it, to feel the weight of all those gathered people across all those thousands of years, performing their important, inexplicable acts in the presence of whatever they most deeply believed in. There is a ritual in certain Native American traditions of the Great Plains that involves a dancer being suspended from a tree or pole by wooden skewers passed through the skin of the chest or back, and dancing in this state, sometimes for hours, sometimes while staring into the sun, until the skewers tear free. It is called the sun dance, and it was practiced widely among many nations of the plains: the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Crow, the Arapaho, before being criminalized by the United States government in 1883, a prohibition that lasted until 1978, when the American Indian Religious Freedom Act restored the legal right to practice it. To outside observers, including the government officials who criminalized it, the sun dance was primarily legible as self-mutilation, a primitive and dangerous act that needed to be stopped for the dancer's own good. To the people who practiced it, it was a prayer. It was the most serious prayer available, a gift of the self, specifically of the body and its pain, to the spiritual powers that sustained the world. The sacrifice was not meaningless suffering. It was currency in a cosmic economy, an offering that required something real, something that cost you, precisely because cheap offerings are not serious offers. The dancer was not a victim. The dancer was an agent of his own deepest intention, choosing the most profound form of sincerity available to him. The ritual made complete and perfect and elegant sense within the framework that gave it meaning. When that framework is invisible to the observer, when the observer can only see the skin and the skewer and the blood and not the prayer, the ritual looks like harm. It looks like something to be stopped. And this is, perhaps, the most dangerous form of misunderstanding, Not the benign confusion of the curious traveler, but the confident misunderstanding of the authority who is certain they know better. Let us end our journey in Japan, and very quietly, with a ceremony called Obon, which is celebrated in August, and which is not particularly mysterious to anyone familiar with Japanese culture, but which could seem very strange if you arrived at it without context. During Obon, which has been practiced in various forms for roughly 500 years, though its Buddhist roots go back much further, the spirits of the dead are believed to return to visit their families. Lanterns are lit to guide them home. Graves are cleaned and tended. Food is placed at household altars. At the end of the 3-day festival, the spirits are guided back to their world with more lanterns. Sometimes small paper boats carrying flames are floated on rivers or out to sea, the lights drifting away on the dark water until they disappear. And people dance. The Bonodori, the Bon dance, is performed in communities across Japan, a circular dance around a central tower called a yagura. The movement's traditional and specific to each region, the music playing long into the summer night. People dance with their families, with their neighbors, with strangers. Older people teach younger people the steps. Children who have not yet mastered the movements wave their arms and step with great enthusiasm and modest coordination, and this is considered perfectly fine. The dance is not a performance for an audience. It is a greeting to the dead, and an acknowledgement that the line between the living and the dead is not as absolute as we might like to think. To someone from a culture with a very sharp distinction between the living and the dead, a culture that tends to locate the dead firmly in the past and the other world, not in the present and the family home, the whole business of Obon might seem strange. Setting out food for people who are not there, dancing to welcome guests you cannot see, sending small boats of light down a river to escort your grandmother back to wherever she lives now. These things require a particular relationship with time and with death and with the ongoing nature of family that is not universal, that must be learned and felt and lived before the gestures make sense. But there is something in it that reaches past cultural specificity into something more general, something that almost anyone can feel at least the edge of, even from outside. The care of it, the tenderness, the acknowledgement that the people who shaped you do not stop mattering to you simply because they have died. The insistence, which is also a kind of love, that they be welcomed back, that they be given food and light and dancing, that the cord between the living and the dead be maintained with the same kind of attention and effort that we give to any relationship we value. This, perhaps, is the most honest thing that can be said about all the rituals we have visited tonight. From the silent stone enclosures of Göbekli Tepe to the lantern-lit summer rivers of Japan, from the terror and relief of the new fire to the mandatory laughter of Roman priests smearing blood on young men's foreheads, from the drugged darkness of the Eleusinian Hall to the slow arc of the bog water closing over a carefully arranged body. All of these ceremonies were, at their core, attempts to maintain a relationship with the cosmos, or with the dead, or with the divine, or with a social order, or with time itself. The ritual no one understood was, in the deepest sense, always a ritual of connection. And connection is something we understand very well, even when we cannot read the specific language in which it is expressed. There is something comforting in this if you let it settle. Human beings have been performing ceremonies, elaborate, exhausting, strange, costly, joyful, frightening, beautiful ceremonies. For at least 12,000 years, and almost certainly much longer than that, they have done so across every culture, every continent, every social arrangement, every level of technological complexity, from the hunter-gatherers who carried 10-ton pillars up a hill in Turkey, to the families who float paper lanterns on Japanese rivers in August. The form changes endlessly. The impulse does not. We are, all of us, people who perform rituals. We make coffee in the same order every morning, and this is a ritual. We say certain things at certain moments, at funerals, at weddings, at the beginning of meetings and the end of meals. And these are rituals. We mark the passage of time with candles on cakes and fireworks at midnight, and the particular foods of particular seasons. And these too are rituals, which are to say they are ways of insisting that certain moments matter more than others, that time is not uniform, that connection to each other, to the past, to something larger than the individual moment, deserves to be formally acknowledged. The people at Göbekli Tepe who carried those stones and carved those vultures and drank their beer and performed whatever it was they performed in those stone circles were doing something recognizably related to what you do when you gather with the people you love, to mark a moment that matters. The priests at Eleusis who prepared the kykeon and led the initiates through the darkness of the Telesterion were doing something recognizably related to what happens when you sit with a person through a crisis and bring them slowly back to the light. The Mexica who extinguished their fires and plastered their faces and waited in genuine terror for the Pleiades to pass. The Zenith were doing something recognizably related to what happens every time any human being chooses to acknowledge, honestly and collectively, that the future is not guaranteed and that the continuation of the world requires effort and attention and care. We are not so different from them. We are not so different from any of them. We have different frameworks and different cosmologies and different symbolic vocabularies, and the specifics of our rituals would be as baffling to them as theirs are to us. But underneath the specifics, in the place where meaning actually lives, we are all doing the same thing. We are reaching, in whatever way our culture has given us, toward connection. We are saying, in our various inherited languages of gesture and symbol and repetition, this matters. We are here. We are here together. And we want that to mean something. It is late now, and the details of all these ceremonies are growing soft at their edges, blending together into something dreamlike and slow. The stone pillars of Göbekli Tepe, the torchlit corridors of Eleusis, the running priests of Rome, the lanterns on the summer river, they are all here with you, all these millennia of human ceremony, all this accumulated reaching toward meaning. Let them be with you for a moment. Let them be part of the larger story that includes you, that has always included you, that will continue after you in forms neither you nor anyone else can quite predict. The ritual no one understood was always also the ritual everyone understood. In the ways that matter most, in the place beneath words and beneath specific belief and beneath the particular gestures of any particular culture, you understand it too. You have always understood it. It is the same impulse that brought you to this moment, to this hour, to the quiet decision to rest, to let the day go, to trust that morning will come. It always has. Sleep well.